We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Morning, Callum. Great to speak to you. For the listeners who aren't aware of who you are, it'd be great to get a quick background of your career and how you've been doing all these sort of multiple media appearances that you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm a medical doctor by background. I'm a researcher. I do a lot of work on ethics and public policy, particularly relating to life and death, relating to family, bioethics, um, how humans are made, how their lives begin, how their lives end, all those sorts of questions. And I do a lot of public speaking. So over the last few years, especially as the UK and other countries have moved more and more towards a kind of brave new world of biotechnology and liberalizing abortion laws, liberalizing potentially the laws on euthanasia. I've been able to do a lot more speaking into this about why, as a doctor and a researcher, I have concerns about moving in those directions. So yeah, I've published a lot of papers, given a lot of speeches, and done a lot of work on these kind of public policy questions.
What got you specifically into the abortion realm of in terms of your specialty? How did that come about?
Yeah, it was really seeing the numbers, to be honest, at first. I was pro-choice, like most people in the UK, and once I found out how many abortions there were, which is basically nearly 1 in 3 babies now are aborted, and 1 in 3 women in their lifetimes will have an abortion in the UK. This is a huge number. There are 250,000 a year in the UK. And so I thought, okay, this is an issue that is much bigger than I realize, much bigger than most people realize. I at least have to be confident that I know where I stand on it. Because either this is no big deal or it's an extremely big deal. Like it's one of the biggest issues in our world. And so I began to read more about it at medical school. I began to look at the development of the baby in the womb, where it was clear that human life did begin at fertilization and just kept growing from there. I looked at the arguments about personhood. Maybe if it's a human being, it still might not be a person with moral value and with human rights. And so I looked into that debate and I was convinced no, all humans are equal. If it's a human being scientifically, then we have to treat it like a human being morally as well. And yeah, I guess just looking at the impact on women as well, seeing the impact on a woman's mental health, the impact on society, I really was just persuaded over time that we can do much better as a society, that this is ending the life of a human being, that this is happening 250,000 times a year just in the UK. And so I decided I wanted to speak about it because very few other people were speaking about it. I lost some friends, as you can imagine, in the process. But it's been really worth it to see the reaction, to see people really opening their eyes and being open-minded in many cases to change their mind and think, is there something we can do better for women than just saying, you have a choice between your child and your future, and you should probably choose your future and forget about your child and we can end their life. So, yeah, I sort of didn't expect to be involved in this, certainly when I went to med school, but ended up being a passionate supporter of this and a champion of this cause, really just to protect as many women and children as possible.
Was the was the sort of the astronomical numbers of abortion, was that the first thing that made you start to think in terms of about the impacts of abortion, how big it is in the UK? Because to be honest, I did not know those numbers were as high as what you said. I thought they were high, but I didn't realize they were that high. And my second point is that there's something that we've talked a lot about on this show with previous guests is the sort of fertility crisis, or not fertility crisis, lack of people having children. It's been a massive talking point. I'm sure you're well aware in terms of generally the West. So it'd be interesting to get your take on the impact of abortion on that, and also whether the fact that because the numbers were so high that made you first really think I need to actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact very first thing that got me thinking about it. So it's difficult to say, but certainly the numbers were a big part of it in the sort of early research into this and thinking about the issue, and it meant that this was a very important topic for me. I think without the numbers, I would have said I don't really need to look into it that much or speak about it or anything. But it was the numbers that made me think, wow, this is the biggest issue facing this country, and I need to try and do something about it. In terms of the fertility crisis, absolutely, it's a contributor. It's maybe not as big a contributor as certain people suggest, just because if you get rid of abortion, for example, it's not like all those pregnancies still happen and all those babies are born, but rather, if you get rid of abortion, people actually are much more careful with when they have sex, who they have sex with, whether they use contraception. And so you actually get a lot more, I guess you could call it responsible behavior, where people don't get pregnant in the first place, if they're not ready to have a child. So it's not like getting rid of abortion is just the solution in itself to the fertility problem, because most people would just use contraception better, or they would not have sex in the first place. But it certainly does contribute. We know that when countries legalize abortion, their fertility rate goes down significantly quicker than it already was. And in a world where we do have a really huge fertility crisis, this is a huge issue. And so ultimately, I think it's the culture that's the issue. It's the value we place on children, place on families, getting married, versus the value we place on furthering your career at a really young age. And so I think that is the key thing that needs to change in order to solve both abortion and the fertility crisis. But they certainly are very linked. And so, yeah, we've seen the challenges of that, whether it's the economic difficulties, whether it's the just lack of children, meaning a less hospitable place for families and making it harder for the parents that do have children. It's caused a lot of debates about migration and mass migration because, one side will say, well, okay, we can just import people to make up for the lack of children in the UK. Um, the problem with that, other than it being just very unpopular, I'm fairly pro-immigration myself, but of course it's very, very controversial with many people. But the other problem is that other countries are also running out of people. So all the countries that have mass migration from, say, South Asia or from Africa or wherever else to the UK, those countries are all massively reducing their fertility rate. And so even if you say we can make up the labor shortages and so on with people from other countries, that's actually not going to last for very long, even for those people like myself who are pro-migration. So yeah, this is not just a sort of Western crisis or a UK crisis, it's a global crisis. And very soon we're going to be feeling something closer to the full effects of that.
Well, it's Japan's a really good example of this in terms of how bad their crisis is, and they're in a situation now where they may be opening up their borders. They've largely been a bit more restrictive in terms of migration compared to most countries, and now because of their crisis in terms of not enough people being born, and they've got a very aging population, so they're looking apparently to also open up their borders, which causes its own issues. I want to go back to the abortion debate because it feels like only up until the recent bill that was discussed in the UK, we've actually ever spoke about abortion in this country. In the US, but whenever I think of abortion, I think of the US, I think of Roe versus Wade and how much headlines that got in the UK, but we never actually speak about what goes on really in the UK in terms of abortion. So my question is, why do you think that is? Why don't you think we ever really discussed this? And then I'll maybe we'll talk a bit later on in specifically about the bill because I think there's a lot to unpack there. But just on a broader general, before that we talk about the bill, why do we not discuss abortion in general in the UK, like let's say they do in America?
Yeah, I think it's because over time most people have gravitated towards a pro-choice view, and that's become very comfortable and convenient because if a child comes along who's not born at the right time in the right place to the right people, you can just get rid of them, and that's a very convenient position if human life is discardable. If you can just get rid of a really small human being to make life easier for everyone, then of course a society is going to prefer that. But, that obviously comes with costs to our value and our human rights and our morality. Um, I think a lot of it is compounded by the fact that we now, because there are so many people who want to preserve this status quo, and because a growing number of people, especially young people, are beginning to challenge it, it's much better for the status quo if this debate can just be totally shut down. So, I do some debates on this topic, but what we found is that there's basically one person in the UK who's willing to debate from the pro-abortion or the pro-choice side. Literally everyone else says, no, I'm not going to debate. And, the reason they state is that human rights are not up for debate, which is a very sort of sanitized way of saying like we can't really defend this position if it's actually put into the public. I'm very happy to defend human rights in debate, whether it's the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right not to be um, uh, put into slavery, whatever it is. I'm confident that those rights exist, and therefore I'm confident defending them in public in a debate. So
Yeah.
the fact that people are not willing to debate abortion and not willing to defend the right to abortion, I think is an indicator that when the two sides are heard in a kind of equal and fair way, people genuinely and generally much more gravitate towards the pro-life perspective because most of the pro-choice or pro-abortion side is kind of a um, passive, kind of indifferent attitude towards it, and it often relies on just not knowing what abortion involves. So most people, when I tell them what an abortion involves, they're shocked, they're horrified. Even many people who've had an abortion, when they find out, they say, I had no idea that's what it involved, and if I did, I would never have had an abortion. So I think a lot of the pro-choice status quo actually depends on the fact that it is not discussed, because when it is discussed and exposed, it makes people really shocked and therefore increases people's sympathy for being pro-life, which, is a threat to the people with power and influence at the moment.
I couldn't agree more. And I think for me personally, when I've always spoke or thought about this topic, I would have definitely lent to more pro-choice. And I've not really, before even doing any reading or thinking about it, but definitely in the last few years, the more I've read, the more I sort of understand this subject matter, it definitely has started to change my opinion on it. And I think just genuinely, it'd be interesting to get your take on this. It just seems to be, um, I'm not just saying just the West, but definitely something in the West where we're seeing a real lack of value for human life. And I don't know if that's further compelled by the bill, the assisted dying, the abortion reforms. It just feels like there's a real lack of care for human life, and that doesn't sit too well with me at all. And I think that's really a sad place to be. What are your thoughts on this? Because it does feel like in the UK these are two. I've had this feeling for a little while, not that long, but these two bills to me almost really push that even further in terms of we just don't value human life as much as we should. What are your thoughts on it, especially in a medical perspective?
I think that's right. And I think part of it is just losing a sense of kind of moral foundations. Societies have always thrived when they have been built on a common set of principles and values with respect for human rights, respect for life, respect for families, because so much of our culture and our society depends on trusting each other, having the same shared set of values, about defending and protecting each other, about serving each other. And when you have a society that just says, all talk of morality and values is just religion imposing itself on other people, obviously that's nonsense. But when people say that, when there's this sense that anything to do with values or morality is just religion or it's forcing people's views on each other and it's illiberal, when you just focus on individual choice and freedom, inevitably society is going to be eroded because people are going to be focused on themselves. They're not going to be focused on serving each other. There are going to be fewer boundaries about how people can act towards each other. And this isn't just about letting, the baddies do what they want. It's not even just a problem of like the villains being more free to do what they want. The fact is that most of us as human beings are prone to selfishness. We might be better than average. We might have many moments of generosity as well. And there might be some real saints who are really selfless, all the way through their lives. But the average person really looks out for themselves. They're very tempted easily to do what's in their best interests and their benefits. And particularly if there are victims that they can't easily see, if there are victims who can never complain, if there are victims who can never interact or kick up a fuss, or if they're a victim that you never have to look in the eye, then it's very easy for most people to just turn a blind eye and discard them. And that's, of course, exactly the case with abortion, increasingly the case with elderly people who are disenfranchised, maybe have dementia and can't easily object to what's happening to them, can't often understand what's happening to them. Um, I think that taking down those guardrails that protect the most vulnerable doesn't just let the baddies kind of run riot. It actually just opens the door for all of us who have at times selfish moments or, want to just get rid of a problem to make life easier. It really opens a door for that. And sadly, people at the margins of life at the beginning or the end, or those in the middle who are just more vulnerable and have less of a voice than the rest of us, those are the people who feel and bear the cost of that. And so that's, I think, a big part of why we go out into the streets and, we might not be thinking abortion is a huge problem, suicide and euthanasia are a big problem, but we go out into the streets and we see there is no trust here, there is no friendship here, there is no sense of neighborhood, there is no sense of community. All of us feel that, and I think at its very roots, that comes down to this lack of values and foundations as a society that we used to have and that has pretty much disappeared now.
No, I couldn't agree more with what you said. The definite lack of feeling in community in the UK, I think, is such a serious issue. I want to go back on one of the points you made about in terms of elderly people sometimes suffering dementia, having issues, because I want to specifically talk about the assisted dying bill because that was something that was really talked to a lot about in the UK. For lots of listeners who won't fully understand the bill, it'd be great to get just your take on what the bill entails, and then just a bit more information in terms of, from what I understand, you're not a big fan of the bill, and basically an explanation why.
Yeah, you're you're right to say I'm not a big fan. So this is a bill that's a private member's bill from Kim Leadbeater, who's a Labour MP. It's framed as a conscience vote and nothing to do with the government, but Keir Starmer has very deliberately and explicitly made time for the bill and helped to rush it through the Parliament, and has promised that it will be voted on. So it very much is part of the sort of government agenda, even though it's also true to say a significant number of the government members of parliament voted against it, and so they're not to blame. They've done a pretty good job. So this is a bill that would basically introduce a form of euthanasia called assisted suicide, which is where rather than just someone committing suicide, which is already decriminalized for many decades in the UK. What this allows is for a medical professional to suggest suicide to a patient and then to provide them with the means to commit suicide. So, they haven't said, we're going to give you a rope or whatever it is, and probably they won't do that, but why not? If that's fundamentally what the bill is about, helping people to commit suicide, why not allow them to use any method they want? Well, so, more likely it will involve drugs. These are not always very that doesn't always go smoothly either. There are many cases where people take the drugs, they have a load of horrible side effects, and then the drugs don't even work and all sorts of things. They don't just lead to a sort of quick, painless death as they're often suggested. But to come back to the question, fundamentally, this is about the healthcare profession, which, of course, in the UK is an arm of the state primarily, being able to recommend and then assist people to commit suicide, which again is maybe not the first Rubicon to be crossed in medicine. You know, we've already spoken about doctors ending lives of children in the womb for the last 50 years, but certainly it would be another huge, huge barrier to smash down and open the gates for all hell to break loose. Once you give the power to the state to end the life of a human being, not even just guilty human beings, but innocent human beings, um, many of them at their most vulnerable time, where they've just received a terminal diagnosis, where they're feeling sick, they might be feeling alone, they might be feeling stressed or anxious about death, to give the state the power to recommend that they kill themselves and then the power to help them to kill themselves, this I think is just profoundly, profoundly dangerous, no matter how many safeguards you put on it. And to be clear, the bill does not have many stringent safeguards. But even if you put 1,000 safeguards on, this is fundamentally a power that the state should not have. I think all of us have seen how the state has been used in dangerous ways, in authoritarian ways, and has been a threat, especially to vulnerable people. The
Yeah.
idea that we would forget all of that history in other countries and in our own country and give that power to the state once again, to me is really terrifying. And so I'm doing all I can to oppose it myself, along with many, many other groups, particularly those supporting disabled people who feel most at risk from this bill.
I mean, with the one of the things I've been thinking about the last few days in sort of preparation for us speaking is with the assisted dying bill, what are the who is the person who in this situation would be the one who essentially I don't want to say kill the patient, but who'd be the one to make that decision to if the patient says, okay, I want assisted suicide, who would that person be? I'm guessing a doctor. And then second of all, what is there any research in terms of the impact on, let's say, that doctor or that person who has to do that, who has to give that pill or do that thing, and then if we're doing it on a mass scale and this person's had to do it to 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 people, surely there's got to be some sort of mental aspect for that person in terms of assisting somebody dying. Surely there's got to be some sort of concern for that person's well-being.
Yeah, so this is an area that has changed significantly during the debate. So initially they said, well, a judge at the High Court has to approve this, application for suicide. The bill on paper looks fairly robust and strict, so it's limited at the moment to people who have a terminal diagnosis with 6 months left to live. Now, those prognoses of 6 months are totally unreliable. A terminal illness is not very well defined. In theory, potentially could even include something like Down syndrome, could include appendicitis, which will kill you if you don't have treatment. Um, so even those concepts are not well defined, and of course could easily be extended in future. But at least on paper, at the beginning, it's a fairly limited sort of category of people. Now they said at the very start, okay, a high court judge has to approve this after the patient themselves has done so. Um, this was supposed to be strengthened in the committee stage, that they made it more robust and sort of harder to get through to make sure that there are as many safeguards as possible. They actually dropped that requirement and said it has to go to a panel instead. And what we hear keeps changing. Pretty much everyone who has been proposed to be involved in these decisions has said flat out, we cannot manage this in a safe way. We do not have time in our jobs and our professions to look into everything needed to make these decisions. It will fundamentally be unsafe, whether that's the judges or psychiatrists or whoever else. Pretty much all of them have said this is a terrible idea and we are not equipped to do it. So if if even the safeguards are opening their mouths and saying this is not safe, it kind of shows you just how dangerous this bill is and how much it has just run riot through the parliamentary process. So that could still change. And of course, we've seen in other countries that even if there's a limited category of people initially, that ends up being much, much more wide because the safeguards people cannot monitor it properly. So they end up just sort of checking a box and waving it through. And then the politicians say, well, it's happening more liberally anyway. We might as well liberalize it further to stop those people getting in trouble. So that's the standard sort of process we see in every country. So yeah, I think this is a huge concern. You had
Do
a
you,
second question that I
yeah, sorry, what I was going to say is, do you think some of those people some of the safeguard people speaking out because they ultimately don't want that responsibility? They don't want the responsibility of being the person or being part of the panel that essentially assists the killing or assists the dying of someone. Do you think that could be one of the reasons?
I think it is part of it. So and certainly, it introduces certain legal liabilities for them. And of course, it might go against their conscience and they might think this is unsafe. But I think more than that, there's enormous opposition from doctors and others just because they see these patients at very sort of vulnerable times in their lives. So the general medical community is quite split on this, though the balance is against it. But when it comes to this specific bill, there's a very clear majority against this bill, saying this is not safe. And when you look at palliative care doctors, especially those doctors who are most familiar with vulnerable patients at the end of their life, who know what palliative care is, how effective it is. They know when it does work and the rare cases when it isn't sufficient to help someone stop suffering. They know the pressures that people face in those dying moments. They know the abuse that terminally ill patients can potentially face from relatives, among others. These are the people who know far more than absolutely anyone else about all the balance of things at the end of life. And a survey of them a couple of years ago in the UK found that about 90% of them said this should not be legal.
Wow. Wow.
90%. So an overwhelming majority of the experts in this field are absolutely clear this is fundamentally dangerous, even in principle, let alone this particular bill, which has, fewer safeguards and has been more poorly designed than most. So yeah, it's a mix of I don't want to do this, it's against my conscience, or it could be legally risky for me. Plus, this is just terrible for patients. It's a disaster waiting to happen, and it puts the vulnerable at most risk. And as you mentioned before, there are studies showing the impact on those doctors themselves, that this is traumatic for many doctors. Um, in Belgium, I think something like 1 in 3 nurses has actually euthanized a patient without the patient's consent. So this totally revolutionizes the medical profession. And again, just people probably think they didn't hear me right the first time. I think, and I'd have to check this for sure, but I'm pretty confident. 1 in 3 nurses in Belgium says that they have killed someone without the consent of that patient, i.e., they've just murdered them under the euthanasia laws. Of course, some of them feel fine doing that, but many of them are traumatized. And so that's another big concern for this kind of legislation.
I just think, regardless of doctor or nurse, whoever, I just don't think giving somebody the power to end another human's life like that, I think is deeply scary and disturbing. I think the more I hear you speak about it and others, it's just it seems that the bill's flawed, but maybe even the general concept is flawed. Are there countries? I'm not sure if you noticed, are there any countries that have basically no assisted dying bills, like they are completely against and quite strongly against?
Yeah, so most countries don't have euthanasia or assisted suicide. There's only a small proportion of countries. So Switzerland was one of the first. Netherlands and Belgium did it very early, I think in the 1990s. Colombia has legalized it. Canada more recently, a couple of Australian states, and 1 or 2 places in America. Um, so that sounds like a decent list, but out of the nearly 200 countries in the world, it's a very, very small proportion of countries, probably something like 5% of them at most.
Right.
And so the international community is pretty clear on average that this is a radical, radical move, that it is not the global consensus, that most countries and most people all around the world think that instead of killing our elderly relatives, we should be caring for them. I mean,
Yeah.
that is just common sense. But I think I think there are two reasons this is particularly taken off in the West. One is that general sense of values that is being undermined in favor of sort of individualism and just liberty to do what you want at the expense of anyone else. But the second reason is economic. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the fertility rates are still high, which means that there are many, many more working people than there are elderly people. So it's easy for society to find the people and raise the taxes um, in order to look after the elderly generation. But when you go to a country that has a below replacement fertility rate, so you actually have fewer and fewer people in every generation.
Yeah.
I think it used to be something like one retired person for every 10 workers in many economies. In Japan, I think that's now gone down to one retired person for every two workers. So there's a massive, massive shift in the economic burden where we're getting to the point where each worker has to support not only them, but also one elderly person, as well as supporting everything else in society, whether it's the road system, the social benefits, whatever else it is. So the economic cost of retired people is going to be enormous in the future, already is enormous in getting worse, but it's going to get even worse over the next couple of decades because of our low fertility rate. And that leaves societies with an enormous problem. Either you have a huge number of elderly retired people who do not work in a standard sense, do not contribute materially to society in the same way that younger people would, but who at the same time need care from society and often more care because they have more medical conditions, maybe dementia and so on. Either you have that situation or you kill 80% of that group of people. Those are really the only two options in a society that does not have enough children. Either you have a totally unsustainable economic class at the end of life that you have to care for, or you kill most of them. And that sort of, I think, shows into sharp perspective the why having the low fertility rate is so dangerous, because it throws us into this dilemma. So I'm not suggesting that this is an easy dilemma, though, of course, I would say let's not kill 80% of them. Let's just try and do our very best, as insufficient as it might be. Let's do our very best to look after everyone. But really, the reason we're forced into this position of choosing in the first place is because of the fertility problem. And so that's why we're in this position where it's so easy and convenient to say, let's just kill a load of old people, which is essentially what this is going to be about, even if they're starting with a very select subgroup of elderly people at the very beginning.
And that's the big concern, I think, for a lot of people is, like you said earlier, is it may just be a small group for now, but then that could easily get widened and widened and widened until, yeah, there's just a general value of life. And like you said, in terms of terminally ill, I've had so many stories that people, even I know, that were told, given really bad prognosis of how long they got to live, and they've far, far superseded that. So what would happen in the circumstance of that person who's been told 6 months, 1 year to live, when they could live for another 5, 10 years, we'll never know, because with the new bill that they may be inclined to push the button. And going back to the fertility crisis, I suppose it links well with the abortion law, in terms of what's happened there. Again, for people who don't quite understand that bill and don't quite understand what exactly that entails, it'd be good to get your explanation on what exactly the new proposed abortion bill is.
Yeah, so for the abortion amendment, this was not a standalone bill. This was just tagged on to a government bill. at the very last minute, which is part of why people were so outraged about it. They said this is a huge societal change, and it was introduced with just 2 hours of debate on an amendment in a government bill with no public consultation, nothing in the media. It's just sort of thrown in at the last minute with a very tiny debate, which is crazy when you look at the scope of what it says. So the UK already had one of the most liberal abortion laws in the world. In practice, in the UK, you could get an abortion for any reason up until about 6 months of pregnancy. So, really late into pregnancy. Most European countries prohibit abortion after 3 months. The UK says you can have it for any reason up to 6 months. And if the baby is disabled, not just a severe life limiting disability, but any disability at all, even having a cleft lip or cleft palate, then you can already be aborted up to birth, up to the moment of birth in the UK. So it allows for pretty much any situation. The only thing it doesn't allow in the UK is having an abortion between 6 and 9 months for social reasons. That's the only thing that is currently prohibited in the UK. So this amendment, in going further, basically takes those 6 to 9 month period, the third trimester, and it says even in that period, in the 6 months to 9 months, even a day before birth, the woman is allowed to have an abortion, to do an abortion on herself by taking pills or whatever it might be. So it doesn't quite allow medical professionals to do that. It allows women to do that. Um, and of course, most people are outraged at that. They say, of course, women should not be allowed to do that. They shouldn't be allowed to kill a baby the day before it's born by taking abortion pills, which you can now get very easily over the internet or through calling a clinic up and asking for them. Now, that alone is kind of terrifying and horrifying to most people. But when you look at the likely consequence, and I posted this roadmap on X probably a year ago saying this is what's going to happen, is that first they will legalize it or decriminalize it for the woman to do this. What is then going to happen is that women are going to be having abortions by themselves, taking pills at 7 or 8 months. And that is extremely dangerous. To give yourself an abortion near the end of pregnancy is not safe. You need medical supervision, assuming it's ever safe at all. So these women are going to be having abortions at 7 to 8 months. Some of them are going to have very risky situations and going to be admitted to hospital. Some of them may even die as a result. And so what then the abortion industry will then say is, look at all these women having dangerous abortions at the end of pregnancy. Isn't it better that they have medical supervision and we stop criminalizing doctors from giving them that care in those situations? And so they will say, well, then we need to legalize abortion for doctors from 6 to 9 months in the third trimester. And that's the sort of stepping stone to get to ultimately anyone can perform abortions at any stage of pregnancy up to the day of birth. And that I think is what's likely to happen over the next few years is they say, well, we shouldn't just legalize it for women, we should legalize it for doctors as well to keep it safer for women. And so that I think is the clear trajectory of where this is going.
And that sounds absolutely terrifying. Why? I mean, I did see quite a lot of pushback on the abortion stuff. Maybe it's just my ex, my following, and people I speak to, but it seemed to be very quickly out of the news cycle, very, very quickly. Why are we not seeing more people like yourself in the actual medical profession? Because you'll know about this, the details, the impact, so much more than somebody like myself and so many other people. Why are we not seeing enough doctors or people in the medical profession speaking up about how dangerous this is? Forget about the moral, spiritual, cultural, all those impacts. Why are we not seeing more doctors come out and saying about how risky this is medically for the woman?
Yeah, I think part of it is that doctors, just to begin with, are more liberal than average because they're in a higher socioeconomic class. And in general, in the UK, the more wealthy and affluent you are, the less you pay attention to things that actually affect the poorest people in society. So, if suppose your family breaks down, my own family, my parents divorced. I come from a broken family, in that sense. If you're rich enough and wealthy enough, that doesn't impact you quite as much because you can pay for childcare, you can pay for babysitters. There are many things you can do to mitigate the impact of a broken family. You're not going to have even if your child is living with a single mother, she will have enough money to feed them and so on and go to work and whatever else. If you come from one of the poorest sectors in society, family breakdown totally tears your world apart because not only do you have two parents in the first place who might be struggling economically, if you then take that down to one parent who has to not only feed you by themselves, give you all of their time, emotional support, their physical energy, everything else, in addition to all of that, they have to go and somehow work a job to get a single income, not a double income, just to support you in all your material needs as well. So things like family breakdown tear apart the social fabric in a way that most significantly undermines the poorest people in society. But when you go to the sort of higher social levels of society, they don't notice those issues as much. They don't see that family breakdown is something that, yes, is tragic in every sort of layer of society, but particularly devastating for the people in the poorest and most marginalized groups. And so they are much more free to support so-called progressive or liberal policies that tear apart those social institutions that really hold society together at its foundations. So all of that to say, that's the sort of general setting of why is it that sort of more wealthy and richer people tend to have more liberal progressive perspectives. It's because they rely less on the sort of traditional institutions that support society because they can basically pay
Yeah.
to mitigate those or substitute for them. So doctors very much fall into that category. And then when you go into the medical political world, with the British Medical Association and the Royal Colleges and so on, I would say they're even more sort of captured and monopolized by the far left than average.
Right.
It's why almost no one likes the British Medical Association, not even doctors like the BMA, um, because they really have just been captured by a load of lunatics who have extreme politics and don't take any other sort of position into account. These royal colleges will often just put out statements supporting abortion without consulting any of their members at all. They will do zero actual assessment of where their members stand. They'll just put out these statements. So all of that to say, the medical authorities have just been captured over many years by sort of far left extremists. And so even though I'm not saying that the average doctor is super conservative or anything like that or pro-life, they're not. The average conservative is somewhat liberal, but even the average liberal person is shocked by this abortion amendment. They say this goes way too far. The reason you won't hear that from doctors is because they feel disempowered. Because all the medical authorities say, we support this, this is fine. And the average doctor thinks, if I speak out against this, all it's going to do is threaten my career. It's going to make others hate me. It's going to lose me currency with some of the most important people in my profession and the most important institutions in my profession. And so it's much better for me to just be quiet, even if that means, staying silent about something that's really important. So I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that there is just so much social pressure within the medical profession that when it comes to these hot button issues, the fear about speaking out, even among people who are very passionately against, you know, late abortion or euthanasia or whatever it is, they're just so scared. And I've seen that time and time again with my friends who are very much against this. They're absolutely zealously against these things. Even most of those people simply refuse to ever say anything publicly because of how it might affect their career. And so that leads to a culture of silence and a culture of um, that just does not allow debate or dissent in any way.
I mean, it's scary because with the abortion assisted dying, the people probably who like I say will lead to is the lot of these decisions, a lot of the final decisions will be done by doctors, and if they don't have a voice, then and that is incredibly scary in considering everything that's going on. Have you had any pushback in terms of from the British Medical Association or other doctor boards for your views? Because obviously you're quite outspoken about this. I've seen you on many podcasts and other media stuff discussing this. Have they ever said anything to you? Has there been any of those kind of not threats to your career, but is there that kind of concern?
Yeah, I would say to me, the General Medical Council, which is the main professional regulatory body, has been pretty fair. They had one complaint about me, which was totally baseless. Someone complained that a video I posted of an abortion on Twitter was fake. It was a totally real video. I think GMC didn't explicitly say this, but I think they noticed that this complaint was baseless because the video was real, and so they didn't take any action. They have gone after one of my friends. So I have a friend who offers abortion pill reversal, which is where to have an abortion in this country, if you do it through pills, you take two pills and you take them sort of 1 to 2 days apart. So if you take the first pill and then you change your mind, there's a short window that if you take progesterone, you can actually slightly increase the chance that your baby will survive. And
Okay.
so he offers this. It doesn't work every time. He's very honest about the success rate and so on. But there is some evidence that if you take progesterone, you can stop the abortion from happening, uh, and and the baby has a higher chance of surviving. The GMC went after him. They try to say this is unsafe, it's ineffective. My friend sort of took them to court in response, where the expert witnesses from both sides said, sorry, GMC, you're wrong. This is perfectly safe, and there is some evidence that it's effective. And the GMC pretty much immediately dropped their case against my friend. But they did try and go after him for basically for saving lives of women and their children who wanted to keep their baby. Um, the the BMA I don't really interact with because they're just kind of far left lunatics, trade unionist, particularly like the worst kind of trade unionist, and most doctors don't really like them or hesitate to interact with them.
Right.
The other one that I've had most interaction is the RCOG, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Because I'm not a member of them and I'm not an obstetrician, they don't have any sort of authority over me, so there's not much they can do other than sort of smear my reputation and that sort of thing. They, I've had a few run-ins just because they consistently promote misinformation in their statements and on their website. So they've posted a whole load of things that are just clearly demonstrably false. On a couple of occasions, I've managed to get them to concede that and correct the record. But in other cases, they just refuse to reply. Even if you ask for clinical advice about certain situations, they refuse to reply because um, some of their clinical advice, if they gave it, would sort of undermine the abortion narrative. And so
Right.
typically they sort of run away from the debate. They don't say anything because basically because they know that they're wrong. But fortunately, they don't have too much authority um, to do anything to me. They just have the authority, sadly, to mislead and therefore eventually harm members of the public as a result.
Well, one of the things we're talking quite a lot on abortion. What is the medical impact an abortion does to a woman? Like I know it varies from different stages. It'd be good to get what actually happens when an abortion happens to the woman.
Yeah, so there are a number of short-term risks. So the most common would be hemorrhage, just bleeding, and sometimes that's very severe bleeding that can need a transfusion. Particularly dangerous if the woman's anemic or if she has certain other conditions. Um, you can also very often get parts of the baby left inside. This is probably the second most common after hemorrhage. So, um, in many abortions, about 5 to 10% more like maybe 5 to 6%. Some of the baby remains inside the woman, and that can get infected and therefore lead to sepsis and many other problems. And so they need a surgical procedure to remove those parts of the baby. Third most common is probably likely infection, which again can lead to pelvic inflammatory disease, which in the future can cause infertility or ectopic pregnancies or miscarriages, chronic pain, various other problems. Um, and then a variety of rarer problems like perforating the uterus, things like that. You can then get long-term complications. The most well recognized of those would be preterm birth. So if a woman has an abortion, she's about 30 to 40% more likely that in a future pregnancy, the baby will be born too early. And many
Well,
people listening to this will know what that involves. They might have had a premature baby. They know how much that can cause in terms of complications, in terms of the baby needing ICU. Sometimes, sadly, the baby passing away as a result, huge economic costs, potentially long-term disability as a result. So preterm birth is the most significant, and the evidence shows that the more abortions you have, the higher your risk of preterm birth in future. And then the other one that most women, in the general public are aware of, but it's very much hidden by the medical profession, somewhat implausibly because everyone knows it, is the mental health complications. So the evidence shows basically that if you have an abortion, then you have a significantly increased risk of anxiety, suicide, alcohol abuse, and drug abuse. And these are, of course, some of the most significant problems in any society. Mental health problems, suicide, drugs, and alcohol. These are some of the most basic social pathologies that lead to the disintegration of families and communities. And we know that abortion is a major cause of those. Again, as I said, though, the medical profession on the whole tends to just avoid talking about that, refusing to give these women informed consent about those issues. And of course, that's a significant part of why we have this mental health epidemic in our
yeah.
society. I remember having a debate with a leading abortion advocate a few months ago, and she said, I just don't really believe this mental health stuff because if abortion is this common, a quarter of a million a year, and if it causes mental health problems, we would see an epidemic of mental health problems in our country. And I was extremely puzzled by that remark because that is exactly what we hear about on the news every other week is the mental health epidemic in our country. So I think, we have, of course, abortion is not the only cause, but it's a significant cause of that, and one that definitely needs to be talked about more.
Fascinating. I think that's what's, I think a lot of listeners listening to this will have a much broader understanding in terms of what the impact of abortion does to the body, to the mind. And I think that's what's really scary with this bill in terms of it's going to open the floodgates to argue even more abortions, knowing that we already have a crazy high number occurring in the UK. Is there any chance of this amendment getting reversed? Or is there any plans for people to try and reverse this amendment?
It's a good question. I think it's possible that it could be amended in some way in the Lords, but I don't know the details of that.
Right.
Um, I think it's unlikely that it would be significantly amended, sadly, so it probably will become law. But I think the Lords might be able to do something about it. And then there's always a chance that the whole bill gets voted down. That would, of course, need a large number of Labour MPs to vote it down. And I haven't seen, they've been there's been a huge backlash on the welfare issues, but I haven't seen a huge backlash on this particular bill. So it probably will become law. On the other hand, Reform looks like they are going to commit to repealing it if they get in power. And I think that will put pressure on the Conservatives as well. And so, even if it will likely pass in this parliament, I think it's important people know this is not the end and there will be an opportunity to repeal it and to have
Right.
something that is much more balanced, that is much more in line with public opinion, and that will save a lot of women and children from going through this trauma or from even being killed, in the end of pregnancy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's important that people focus on this issue still over the next few years, that they put pressure on Reform and the Conservatives to say, let's get rid of this if we get into power, which looks very likely at the moment, because this issue is not going away. Uh, but there is a significant opportunity to limit the damage in future governments. So it's key that we really keep speaking about it, and put pressure on our politicians to get rid of it as soon as possible.
Hopefully that can happen. Cam, it's been amazing speaking to you. We have like a closing ritual on the show where I ask the guests for an unpopular opinion that they have that they think should be popular. So, what's your unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular?
I think it shouldn't be unpopular, which I guess is part of the question. Um, I really think we need to talk more about family breakdown and the way that it impacts kids. The evidence is absolutely abundantly clear on this. Like the evidence is absolutely conclusive that if you have a broken family, the kid is going to be worse off, and also the parents are going to be worse off, but especially the kids who are most vulnerable and most in need of protection and nourishment at the beginning of their lives. So um, I think the reason people think this is unpopular or it's treated that way is because it sounds like you're kind of having a go at single mothers and you're saying they're bad people because they should have a husband, who's the father of their kids. I think the reason that we see single mothers as so heroic for those people, when we say stop bashing single mothers, they're doing a great job and they're doing a tough job. I think that's true, and we're not bashing them. The whole point is that the reason they're so heroic and the reason their job is so tough is precisely because parenting is a job that was meant for two people to
Yeah.
do. Single mothers should not be expected to do the job of two people. They should not be encouraged or forced or made to do the job of two people. They should never have been put in that position in the first place. So, of course, if it's not their fault and they're in that position, we should do everything we can to support them, to encourage them, to help them, and to praise them for the incredible job they do. But I think at the same time, if we just run away from this question about how that happened in the first place, then we're inevitably going to end up with a society and families that are much more broken and much more damaged as a result. So I guess that's how I'd summarize it. Let's not bash single mothers, let's not attack them, let's support them, but let's also tackle the more challenging and controversial question of how did that happen in the first place and how can we prevent that happening in future? Because it is that disintegration of the family which is at the heart of the disintegration of the community and even the disintegration of children as they struggle with loneliness, with mental health problems, with a lack of discipline, a lack of responsibility. I think so much of that comes down to the fact that they were not given the best start in life that they actually deserved. And so that's the one thing that I think we really need to speak more about as a society in the UK.
I think definitely so. I mean, every single stat would support what you've said in terms of the impact, the likelihood of any kind of success, whether it's academic, economic. It's always with the chances are at least 4 to 5 times higher in two-parent households versus single. The chances of going to jail, going into poverty, all the negative stuff is significantly increased when it's a single parent household. And I think it was something that really, at the time, turned me off BLM 4 or 5 years ago when on their page they had in their manifesto which said about the destruction of nuclear family and the lack of importance for that family. And I remember thinking that is such a bad thing to say, especially when it affects, in particular, the Caribbean community so badly in terms of they're the highest percentage of people that have single parent. And I think that attributes to some of the issues that communities can have. So I think what you've said there is, yeah, really, really powerful. And I think definitely I couldn't agree more that it should be discussed more. Um, but yeah, amazing speaking to you, Callum. And yeah, thank you for all the amazing work you're doing.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.